Thank you all for coming this morning for our monthly Launchpad lecture that we hold on the first Friday of every month. Tell your friends, bring your friends, and so on and so forth, spread the word. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker this morning, who is Leah F. Tukey. She is the Curator of History at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces. She earned a master's degree in agricultural history and rural studies from Iowa State University. Her job at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum involves research and writing for exhibits and maintaining the museum's library and archives. Leah had the opportunity to curate the exhibit, Home on the Range, From Ranches to Rockets, and that is currently on exhibit at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum. If you've not had the opportunity to see it, I highly encourage you to do that. That's what she's going to be talking about this morning in the lecture. I'd also like to let you know that Leah actually worked here several years ago. She led a very successful education and summer camp program, and we are honored and pleased to have you back. Welcome, Leah.
I'm gonna get my water back here. Nothing like being prepared. Nothing like being prepared. Okay, I aim this here, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right, thank you so much, Kathy, for that introduction. It is a pleasure to be here today. So my presentation today is based on an exhibit that we installed at the New Mexico Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in the fall of 2019. The exhibit was intended to be up through 2020, which was the 75th anniversary of White Sands Missile Range. And we were looking forward to being part of the range's celebration. But of course, COVID-19 had some different ideas. And now we are hoping to be able to keep this exhibit up through this year, so through the end of 22. We don't usually have exhibits up that long, but you know, things happen. I want to share a little bit of history about this exhibit and where the idea came from before I get started. Let's see if I can figure this out. Ha! I am not very technologically savvy, even after having worked here for several years. This image is not a photoshopped image. It is an actual photo taken by Judson Carruthers, an official White Sands Missile Range photographer for 35 years, from the 1950s to the 1980s. The rocket you see is a Redstone. I don't know what brand the windmill is. The Redstone was a direct descendant of the German V-2 rocket, developed by a team of predominantly German rocket engineers under the leadership of Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been brought to the United States after World War II as part of Operation Paperclip. The Mercury rocket that was used on May 5, 1961 to launch Alan Shepard on his suborbital flight to become the second person and the first American in space was a derivation of the Redstone. Now you may be asking, why would a farm and ranch museum have an exhibit on rockets? And that would be a legitimate question. Well, this is what several years ago, when I was the director of education here at the New Mexico Space Museum, I learned a lot about the missile range and what goes on out there. And because of my background in agricultural education or history, I was very interested in learning more about the ranchers who lived out on the range before the military took over during World War II. But back then I thought it would be a fascinating exhibit. But since this was a space museum, the ranching angle didn't seem to fit. Years went by, and meanwhile I got a job as the history curator at the Farm and Ranch Heritage Museum in Las Cruces. And one day, someone dropped off an envelope full of pictures, and when I opened it, this photo blew me away. I thought, there is the opening photo for my Ranching at the White Sands exhibit that I've been thinking about for more than 10 years. I first decided to just focus on the ranching story, but was later convinced that we should also tell the story of the rockets and the missile range. And the rest, as they say, is history. I'm going to start this conversation with life at White Sands and the surrounding areas before World War II. Whoops, wrong one. I did it right once. In the early 1900s, much of the arid land east of Las Cruces, including the San Andreas Oscura Mountains in the Tularosa Basin, was ranching country. Many of these ranchers came from Texas in the late 1800s and found the grass tall and plentiful. They soon realized that they had arrived during a particularly wet climate period and that raising cattle would not be as profitable as they had once believed. But they stayed on. By 1940, the typical ranch in the area was composed of small pieces of privately owned land, shown here in red, supplemented by large parcels of federal and state land, shown in yellow and blue, which the ranchers leased for grazing purposes. Life on the range was filled with opportunities, challenges, hardships, and rewards. To be a successful rancher, you had to be self-sufficient. No matter where your land was, it was a long way to town and a hard road to get there. A rancher needed to be able to repair windmills, build fence, cut lumber, dig water wells, create water distribution systems. Blacksmithing and mechanical skills were necessary in order to keep the equipment in good working order. Ranchers also needed to protect their livestock from wild animals that lived in the desert and mountain landscapes. A rancher had to be handy with a gun and able to set a trap to catch predators common to the area like black bear, wild cat, wolf, and coyote. There is literally a sea of water under the Tularosa Basin. But because it is heavily laden with minerals and usually measures out to be saltier than ocean water, the ranchers who lived on the flats of the basin could not use the water they pumped from the ground. They needed to capture rainwater or pipe water in from natural springs. The most common tactic of obtaining water for those who lived in the mountains and at higher elevations was to hand dig or drill wells and to use windmills to pump the water out of the ground. By the time the local ranchers realized there was not enough water to maintain grass for their cattle and in many cases water for their livestock, it was too late. They had settled in, brought family members west, built homes, and made homesteads. Most families on the range raised cattle and goats. Ranchers who owned land on the flats and who had reliable sources of water could raise cattle I have not done this for a long time, you guys. However, the carrying capacity could be as low as 7 or 8 head per section. And a section, if you don't know, is 640 acres. Just a comparison, in Iowa, the carrying capacity is 2 acres for each cow-calf pair. So quite a bit of difference. The ranchers who lived in the mountains surrounding the Tularosa Basin were more likely to raise goats that ate less than cows and were more suited to the rough terrain. While at the end of the 19th century, many ranchers had been raising sheep, by the 1930s, much of the grasses had disappeared, and the landscape and grasses had disappeared from the landscape, and goats were better able to survive on prolific shrubs. Two challenges that faced ranchers when it came to feeding their families. There were 2 challenges. There was a long way to town to purchase groceries, and there was no way to refrigerate food. Ranch families dealt with both of these problems by purchasing large quantities of dry and canned goods. Many families planted orchards and grew their own fruit. They also had gardens and canned the produce that they raised. Meat was easy to come by, but it was nearly impossible to store large amounts of slaughtered beef or even the meat from a goat or a sheep. Many ranchers would share meat with their neighbors and family members. While refrigeration was difficult, there were some creative methods for preserving fresh food items like milk, eggs, and meat. Many ranchers had cisterns for collecting and holding water for the home. Because these were dug into the ground, they were cool, and you could hang a basket inside to hold items and keep food cold. You could also wrap up a slab of meat in waxed paper and burlap before wrapping it in an old quilt to be kept in the coolest part of the house. By the late 1930s, some of the ranchers were able to buy gas-powered refrigerators that burned propane instead of using electricity. Distance from the closest community with a doctor was a problem for ranch families when it came to injury and illness. Accidents, snake bites, pregnancy and childbirth, and diseases of old age were common. But because ranch folks didn't get to town very often, catching communicable diseases like colds and flu were less likely. Most women made arrangements to go to town to deliver their babies, but on occasion a surprise early birth happened, and when it did, the family had to pitch in to get the job done without a doctor or midwife to assist. Verena Andrig Mahoney remembers, we had sore throats and stuff like that, but we gargled kerosene. Or Daddy would make cough drops with sugar and kerosene. Put some kerosene on the sugar and then burn it. Strike it with a match. Light it up. It was hard like cough drops. Sounds awful. Much life on the range, entertainment was homemade. Saturday night would find ranch families gathered together with neighbors to enjoy a card game or a dance. It was common for people to have dances at the local schoolhouses. But the most popular place was the dance floor at the Leland Miller Ranch. Miller built the portable dance floor with numbered boards that could be taken apart and put back together whenever he wanted. Just throw a little sawdust on top and away you go. Ranchers brought their own instruments and provided the music. A potluck meal was also standard. The dancers could go on into the early morning hours, but there was often enough energy left over to participate in a ranch rodeo the next day. Ranch children, like all children, create their own entertainment. When they weren't busy tending livestock, working in the garden, or doing their schoolwork, ranch kids enjoyed riding horses and outdoor games. The large holding tank at the Lucero Ranch was a popular place to swim, and some kids remember ice skating on a water tank during a particularly cold winter. Children's education was another challenge which ranchers faced head-on. There were several different options. Some youngsters went to school in small communities like at Cutter and Ingle on the west side of the range, Bingham on the north, or Oscura and Bryce on the east. In order to get to these schools, they rode a horse, walked, or were delivered by car or bus. That's one of the school buses right there, that top picture. Other families could afford to keep a second home in larger towns like Alamogordo, Tularosa, Las Cruces, or Socorro, with children attending the local schools. Other children enrolled in boarding schools like the Loreto Academy in Las Cruces. Some families built their own neighborhood schools like the one at Verdin Canyon that was just a few miles from the Henderson and Wood ranches. The Cox family at the San Augustine Ranch hired a tutor and had a classroom in their home. Ranch houses came in all shapes and sizes and were made from a wide variety of material. As one might expect, in New Mexico, many houses were built of adobe bricks. It was a building material you could make yourself on site. Normally, the adobe bricks were covered with stucco to protect them from erosion by wind and rain. Another abundant building material, especially in the mountains, was stone. Mortar or mud was used to fill and seal the gaps between the stones and bind them together. Due to the absence of large trees in the area, there were very few log cabins. The other building style used by ranchers was wood framing using board and batten. Because board and batten are not airtight, the families who lived in these homes covered their interior walls with linoleum and layers of cardboard and newspapers. So as I said earlier, life for ranchers and their families on the range was filled with opportunities, challenges, hardships, and rewards. But in 1942, an event that took place thousands of miles away brought ranch life as they knew it to an end. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by the naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Now, this is a famous declaration given by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on the day after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and it announces the event that would change the lives of these ranchers at White Sands forever. Before Pearl Harbor, in early 1941, with war raging in Europe, U.S. officials looked at the Tularosa Basin as a possible training site and bombing range for Britain's Royal Air Force. The bombing of Pearl Harbor changed these plans. On January 20th, 1942, an executive order established a training range for U.S. crews in the Tularosa Basin. Called the Alamogordo Bombing Range, it was just one of dozens scattered throughout the Southwest. New Mexico alone had 13 bombing and gunnery ranges and 8 air bases during the war. Army Corps of Engineer representatives visited to survey the ranches and tell the owners that they had to move out. They carried lease agreements stating that the lands would be needed until the end of the war, and the owners would receive annual payments based on the size of their ranch units. Ranchers were told that they had to remove their livestock as they would not be allowed back on the land until the end of the war. Ranch families performed their patriotic duties and complied with the orders. Some were only given a few weeks to move. Because the United States was not well prepared for war, the Army wanted ranchers out as soon as possible so that the training of millions of men needed for the conflict could begin. Unfortunately, their methods of removal were often rushed and harsh. To this day, many families affected portray Army management as heartless and cruel. Many of the families had spent decades living and working these ranches through good times and bad. They were proud and self-reliant. None were rich, so they had very few resources for moving thousands of goats and cattle and no place to move them. The Army didn't provide any financial assistance for the moves, and they didn't make any lease payments until after the first year. With so many animals suddenly for sale, there was a glut on the market, and ranchers were forced to sell their livestock at rock-bottom prices. The forced relocation and future actions of the military left them angry and rightly led to years of resentment. One ranch woman said, with the war and all of its anguish, there was no reason for the ranchers to be treated in the rude and dictatorial manner by these employees of the government. Our story now moves from the life of ranchers to life, from the life on ranches to life on the missile range. So where do we start with this story? Well, I think we have to start with the proverbial elephant in the room. And when I worked on this exhibit, this is a story I did not want to tell. I thought, we don't need to tell this part of the story. But it turns out we did. In 1942, in response to reports from European scientists that the Germans might be building an atomic bomb, President Roosevelt authorized the formation of the Manhattan Project. The atomic age began July 16, 1945 at Trinity Site. Trinity Site is one of the most historically significant places on the planet. It plays a role in our story because ranches belong to brothers George, Dave, and Ross McDonald were used for the test site, base camp, and ground zero. Scientists at Los Alamos, New Mexico, the scientific center for building an atomic bomb, came up with 2 bomb designs. One used uranium-235 and was relatively simple. It was used to destroy Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945. The second design used 13.5 pounds of plutonium at its core and was a more efficient and sophisticated weapon. It was tested at Trinity Site and was dropped on Nagasaki, Japan on August 9, 1945. The question many people ask is, why did the government choose White Sands to test the atomic bomb? In fact, many people think that White Sands Missile Range was created as a site to test the bomb. This is not true. For the testing of the plutonium bomb, secrecy and security were of utmost importance. Los Alamos scientists looked at 8 different sites and chose the secluded desert of southern New Mexico at the north end of the remote Alamogordo bombing range. In the fall of 1944, soldiers started arriving at Trinity Site, an 18 by 24 mile area, to prepare for the test. Base camp, where the soldiers lived, was located at the Dave and Ross McDonald Ranch. The George McDonald Ranch was used as an assembly site for the bomb's plutonium core. Ground zero, just 2 miles away, was where the bomb was detonated atop a 100-foot steel tower. Although no information on the test was released until after the atomic bomb was used against Japan, people in southern New Mexico knew that something had happened. The shock broke windows 120 miles away. Army officials simply stated that the munition storage area had accidentally exploded on the Alamogordo bombing range. So there it is, a brief discussion about the elephant in the room. Now let's talk about the first rocket that was tested at White Sands.
Excuse me.
Yes.
When you say it was tested at the McDonald Ranch, the ranch was vacated though.
You know,
so it's just the building?
Yeah.
Okay.
But we're gonna, I'll take questions at the end,
Oh,
okay?
sorry.
It's okay, it's all right. So the first, this is why I don't want to take questions, because I don't remember where I am. That's okay. Here I am. The first rocket launched at White Sands Proving Ground was the WAC Corporal. WAC stands for Without Attitude Control. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech received orders in 1945 to build a rocket capable of carrying a 25-pound package of meteorology instruments to an altitude of 100,000 feet. They built the WAC Corporal and sent it to White Sands to be tested. The rocket was 12 inches in diameter and 16 feet long. It burned acid and aniline and generated about 1,500 pounds of thrust. To make the WAC as light as possible, JPL used only 3 fins instead of 4 and welded the outside skin to the internal components. This meant it didn't need a weighty internal bracing. Even with these modifications, the rocket was underpowered. Engineers added the Tiny Tim rocket motor as a booster. This motor burned for less than a second, produced 50,000 pounds of thrust, and with the booster, the WAC Corporal reached an altitude of 227,040 feet. So now we've talked about, I wanted to mention the very first rocket ever tested, but now let's talk about the most important rocket that was tested at White Sands, at least during this time period, the early years of the range. The German vengeance weapon. The German V-2 was the first man-made object to go into space. It was designed in Nazi Germany and assembled underground by concentration camp prisoners. The first successful flight was on October 3rd of 1942, when the missile reached an altitude of 60 miles and landed about 120 miles downrange. The gentleman up in the center of the dark suit, that's Werner von Braun. The V-2s were 46 feet tall and 5.5 feet in diameter. At launch, they weigh about 27,000 pounds, with 19,000 pounds of propellant and a 2,000-pound warhead. The missile had a range of about 200 miles and fell on its target at 3,500 miles per hour, just 5 minutes after launch. Other experiments measured cosmic radiation. Did I just miss something? Missed a whole page. Scientists at no, I didn't miss a whole page. Uh-oh, now we have problems. I remember when I took this off the printer yesterday, it got out of order and I forgot to put it back in order. So here we go. Though more than 3,000 V-2s were launched in Europe during World War II, more people were killed building the rockets than died at target sites. The missile did not significantly affect the war effort and was considered a failure as a weapon. However, It marked a breakthrough in technology that led to the space race. Two 1,200-gallon propellant tanks took up most of the space in the V2. When asked why Germans used alcohol for fuel, Konrad Dannenberg, a propulsion expert for von Braun, said, since Germany had no oil wells for fuel, the V2 had to use alcohol. He went on to explain that the German government asked booze sellers and makers to distill as much ethyl alcohol from potatoes as possible to use for fuel. The V2 had large fins in the tail section to provide stability and a nose cone with a warhead where the warhead was normally located. The warhead was composed of TNT and ammonium nitrate. At White Sands, the nose cone was used to house various instruments and experiments. The control compartment housed the gyroscopes and other devices used to guide the rocket to its target. It also held timing devices to shut off the flow of fuel to the engines. Colonel Holger Toftoy was in Europe at the end of World War II and was instrumental in bringing the V2 material and V2 scientists to the United States. When he formed the V2 Upper Atmosphere Panel to review payload proposals, he included both military and civilian scientists. This led to an array of experiments that flew on the V2 and paved the way for manned space exploration. Many scientific experiments were conducted using the V2. National Geographic magazine flew a camera on board and took look-down pictures of the Earth. The photos showed the curvature of the Earth, and meteorologists recognized that looking at weather from above the clouds had a great advantage. Other experiments measured cosmic radiation and the effects of a weightless environment. The Air Force studied rhesus monkeys during spaceflight. They discovered that during the stressful parts of the flight, the animals' heart and respiration rates were within normal range, giving them confidence that humans would someday ride safely in a rocket into space. So if I were telling this story in a dissertation or a book, I would have a thesis statement. And my thesis would be that if it were not for the V2 rockets that arrived at White Sands Missile Range at the end of World War II, the military might just have packed up at the end of the war and moved out, like they did in so many other places. But 300 railroad cars full of V2 parts, as well as all of von Braun's staff and personnel, came to southern New Mexico. With this arrival, the military understood that there was more to this V2 stuff than just a weapon of war. Somehow they knew that this was very important to the future of the country. And, like the ranchers who arrived from Texas in the late 1800s before them, they stayed on. After the arrival of the V2, the missile range transitioned from a wartime research facility to a military base with larger personnel numbers who focused on research and testing. During the 1950s and 60s, most of the ranchers realized they were not getting their land back, and they moved on to other endeavors. Beginning in 1970, ranch unit leases were no longer included public domain lands, leaving only small privately owned parcels and dramatically reducing annual fees paid to ranchers. In 1974, Congress authorized the purchase of private ranch lands, but provided only enough money for 86% of the land. The government continued to lease the remaining land until 1980, when more funds were appropriated. In 1980, there were only 34 owners who had not settled with the government. Most sold voluntarily. The Corps of Engineers, under the law of eminent domain, filed in federal court to have the rest of the land condemned for purchase. They then deposited the appraised amounts into the ranchers' bank accounts, and the battle for the ranches at White Sands came to an end. Remember that what I said earlier, that the reason Trinity Site was important to our story was because of the ranchers who lived there before the war. Well, one of those ranchers was Dave McDonald, and he was one of the last to give up. Prior to World War II, Dave McDonald and his brother Ross owned 640 acres of private land and leased more than 22,000 acres. In 1942, when the government took possession of their land, the brothers received $1,385 per year plus $1,000 for improvements. In 1948, the payment rose to $7,055. From 1950 until 1970, they received $7,635 per year. And in 1970, when the government stopped compensating ranchers for their leased land, the McDonald's payment dropped to $2,048. When money was made available for purchase of all the remaining privately owned land on the range, Dave McDonald refused to sell. In October of 1983, the court, there's Dave right there. In October of 1983, the court rendered a judgment valuing McDonald's land at $160,000 and awarded a deed for the land to the government. In the end, the brothers were paid almost $450,000 for the leases and the final purchase of their 640 acres of private land. So of course my presentation today only covers a small part of the story. The actual exhibit tells much more. As part of the exhibit, we constructed a model home based on the tiny Bennett Potter home that still stands at White Sands Missile Range. We also constructed a model of LC-33, which is the launch complex where the V-2 was tested. You can walk through the building and watch actual footage of the V-2 being launched, both successfully and not so successfully. We included several exemplars in the exhibit. 4 ranch families who represent all those who made their homes at White Sands before World War II, and 4 members of the science and military community who were influential in the growth and development of White Sands Missile Range. We included many artifacts to tell the story as well. A wind generator that once produced power for radios and lights that made ranchers' lives better. A huge bear trap that was used to protect livestock. And 2 kid goat sheds, one which was repurposed by clever ranchers from a military tent cap. On the rocket side of the exhibit, there are pieces of trinitite produced by the explosion of the atomic bomb. We have several items brought to the United States from Germany with the V-2 rockets, including a rocket engine, film readers, and a cinetheodolite camera. It took me a year to learn how to say cinetheodolite. We also included a wall of artifacts and images that tell the story of modern-day life at White Sands Missile Range. It's definitely worth the trip to the museum. And as I mentioned earlier, the exhibit should be on display through the end of 2022. And we hope you'll all come to Las Cruces to see it. One final word before I take questions. I would like to acknowledge my co-curator of this exhibit, Jim Eccles. Many of you probably know Jim. He was the public relations officer at White Sands Missile Range for 30 years, and he wrote the book, Pocket Full of Rockets, History and Stories Behind the White Sands Missile Range. Much of the information I used in this exhibit comes from Jim's book, and he made my job so much easier with his knowledge and understanding of this topic. I'd also like to acknowledge Human Systems Research, Inc., HSR, conducted interviews and collected photographs and ephemera back in the 1990s, early 90s, and they compiled all that information and which we used for the ranch side of this exhibit. The photographs from their work are now part of our archives at the Farm and Ranch. White Sands Missile Range and the New Mexico Museum of Space History provided the photos for the rocket side. And I don't see Sue or Jim here, but I wanted to thank them for their help with this exhibit as well. So again, thank you for the opportunity to talk today. I'll try to answer your questions, but just remember, fair warning, it's been a few years since I did this exhibit, so I'm a little rough on the science and military side, but I bet you there's a couple people in the audience that probably know more than I do, so maybe they can help if you have questions. So that's it. Sorry, it was kind of rough. Like I said, I haven't done this for years. It's something I used to do a lot. But anybody have any questions? Yes.
Is there a list of the families that were moved anywhere?
There is. I never found a compiled list of everybody. There were more than just ranchers. There were also miners out there. So just I didn't find a complete list. The HSR people have a pretty good They interview a lot of people, so, yes.
Yes, we have books at the museum
What's that?
down here, the Tularosa
Oh, okay.
Museum of
Okay.
History.
I'll-
And we have books with lists of those people that
I'll
own the
get
land.
there. Thank you.
Yeah. It was because everybody kind of left, and there were different times, and there was the time period when people could live out there and still, while the bombing was, the testing was all going on, there were some people that were able to stay, and that didn't work out very well. So, it's kind of hard to find exactly who was where and when they left and where they were and all that. So I saw another hand. Yes, sir.
Was there any pattern to what the ranchers and their families did after they left? Like, did they stay in ranching in other places, or did they just...
Well, there wasn't really a pattern. There were a lot of different things that happened. In our exhibit, we chose 4 people who were kind of, exemplars for the rest. The Potter family, I think it's Tularosa, it could be La Luz, but I think it was Tularosa. They had a grocery store. They opened a grocery store and were quite successful. Of course, we looked at the Cox family because they're kind of our founders of the feast at our museum, and so we focused on them, and they were actually able to keep some of their land, which was pretty unusual. The Love family, he was a doctor, and he was in El Paso, and this was kind of his, not a hobby farm because his family members lived on it, but they went on to different things. And so, and then the Luceros, we focus on the Luceros, the 2 brothers who were deputy sheriffs in Las Cruces and real famous for other things. They went back to Las Cruces, I think. So some people moved there. I know some people that had land on this side over here on Alamogordo, closer to Alamogordo. And they got land, they kept their land that was on this side of the range, and they continued to ranch and kind of moved further up towards Cloudcroft, I think. So lots of different things. Some people just left. Some, it was a tough time. I really wanted this exhibit to be fair to both sides, because if you lived out there, it was a really hard thing to do, but we were in the middle of a war. And so what I think what really happened that was tragic was the fact that the military and the government, we didn't really tell these people right away, we're done, you just need to move on. They kind of drug it out and for years, up into the 80s. So people held on to hope, and they tried to, they wanted to go back, and it would have probably been better if they had just said, sorry, this is what we're going to do. But, who knows? So I'm not a military government expert either, so. Anybody else? Yes?
Any idea roughly how many ranches were involved? How many were annexed by the government for this Los Angeles ranch?
There were hundreds of ranches out there. So some real small, and like I said, most of these, like that one image I showed, most of the actual ownership out there was pretty small, 160 acres. The McDonald's really had probably one of the biggest ranches on the range. So there were lots of people that were displaced. Well, yeah, Mike.
I had to look it up, but the guy that's standing next to the whack corporal is Frank Molina. He's in our Hall of Fame.
Yep, those pictures all came from you guys, so.
Did they?
Yeah.
And he was a member of the Communist Party, didn't put it down on his security list.
Really?
Fled the country, was indicted in absentia. He had put $250 in to help start Aerojet, never sold it, and he fled to Paris, became a famous painter, and his shares were worth multi-millions.
See, I slid a communist in the story. Actually, I had a little boy one time. I was giving a tour to little kids, middle school kids, at the exhibit, and this. I was talking about Werner von Braun, and there was this little boy, and he was very serious. Most of the kids couldn't care less, and they were kind of wandering around. But this little boy was following me and listening to every word, and we got to Werner von Braun, and he said, "Werner von Braun is my hero." And I said, "Well, he was a very smart man, and he did a lot of really good things, but he was a Nazi." And he goes, "I know." I went on and tell him, that he was good, and we did all this stuff for space. I felt really kind of bad about that. I shouldn't have told him he was a Nazi, but he already knew that. So, yes, sir.
Are any of the McDonald's still in the area?
Oh, does anybody know here? Do you know, Mike? Are there any McDonald's still around?
That I don't.
I don't know. His niece lived in Albuquerque, and when he went back out on the ranch in '83, that's part of the story. He went back out, took his, I think he had a rifle, or like an old shotgun, and a pistol that was not in good condition. And he and his niece went back out there, and they snuck on the range. A good friend of mine and one of our volunteers, Dan Duggan, was in charge of the range that day. He was sort of the second in command, and the commander was gone. And so he had to go out there and talk to Dave, and he tells a great story. I wish I could tell his story, but anyway, he sits up on the tailgate with Dave, and he says, is that gun loaded? He said, yeah. And Dan's like, you really shouldn't probably have a loaded gun out here, Dave. But anyway, they convinced him to leave. But his niece was with him, and she lived in Albuquerque at the time, and so she's probably still around. And she was fairly young at that time. So, but it was just tragic. And people sometimes get mixed up with the story from the McGregor Range. The guy that, remember Fire on the Mountain? Did anybody see that movie with the guy that refused to leave and he hung on out there until he died, and I think he's buried out there. But that's the McGregor Range, and that was different. And they really did things better there. They really did just tell those people, you're done, you're off, here's some money. They helped them move. And that was later on, but people get kind of confused and think that Dave McDonald was that guy who, I can't remember his name right now. No,
His first name was John, but I can't remember.
Does anybody remember his last name, John?
Racer.
That's it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah. So, two different stories, two different endings. Exactly. Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for coming. Wow, this is a good way to get back into this with a friendly crowd. I appreciate that.